Good afternoon. It's really a privilege and an honor to be able to speak here. And I'm a bit confused now because I don't know in which capacity I'm speaking. I can speak in different capacities here, as you see, and they're all connected in one way or another to Christopher. I speak as president of IIAS, and I salute the Finnish section of IIAS here, which is a firm supporter of IIAS, the International Institute of Associative Sciences, and also of ECPA. And of course, Christopher was for a very long time editor-in-chief of the journal of IIAS, the International Review of Associative Sciences, and we're very grateful for that. And Christopher always supported me in the different capacities I had within IIAS. But it's also the Public Governance Institute of Leuven at KU Leuven University in Belgium, where Christopher was a fellow and a research professor. But I'd like actually to speak not just as a very good colleague, sessionally, but as a friend. We have been very, very close to the Pollitt family. Hilka knows this very well, and my family and the Pollitt family knows one another very well, and so I'd like to also speak on my own family's behalf here, and so I'm very grateful for that. Christopher's legacy to public management research is, of course, huge, and it's almost unfair to summarize it in the half an hour time, a whole lifetime. Nevertheless, I will try to highlight some of the ideas and the driving of his thoughts that and his generosity to share that with us. I think if you talk about legacy, you have to also talk about shaping a legacy. What is the origin of a legacy? And I think one of the very crucial elements in Christopher's intellectual life is that almost his private and his public life were very close together, and there was a kind of osmosis in that. And I have referred to that on other occasions. In his home family, his father really influenced him significantly in issues of history and geography. And it's not a coincidence that later on he always absorbed issues of history and geography across his whole life. And one of his last major projects was on place and time. And so from that point of view, the coherence of his thinking is actually extraordinary, and the seeds of his ideas were planted already from his youth. When he took primary school, his father was headmaster in Hove, Brighton, and so from that point of view, this is like shaping an academic from the early beginnings. And then, of course, the second element in his life was after Oxford to be a Mandarin, what he called himself a Mandarin. And I'm just quoting, I will not quote a lot from his private correspondence, but he said, I became a member of the administrative, between brackets, Mandarin class of the civil service when I was 21 in 1967, straight out of Oxford. People could rise very rapidly in those days, and by 1970 I was appointed assistant private secretary to Harold Lever, a senior Labour minister in Harold Wilson's cabinet. And he adds, between brackets, the appointment was simple. Out of the blue, I was called to the permanent secretary's office, and Sir Humphrey said, Pollitt, I'm going to put you into the minister's office. Are you up to it? And that was it, he said. There were two private secretaries. The senior one, Roy, was a higher grade than me. And then in those days, there were no political advisors. All contact with the minister was controlled by two civil service private secretaries. Meetings, phone calls, paper correspondence. You had to go through our office to get to his. The rule was that one of us was always with him, just to make sure the government had an official version of what had been said and what had happened. It was a very intimate relationship. I must say, Christopher's second line is really literature. And so the literature, the novels, he was famous to have read, extremely well read on novels. And at one moment, I suspected him actually, he was the writer, the author of the whole series, Yes, Minister, which including all the jokes which were there. And I think the fact that at the end of that very short period of being a Mandarin, he said after a year or so with Eden was Sir John Eden, which is actually the nephew of Sir Anthony Eden. He was then promoted to a principal position, but he left the ministerial office to be in charge of a section responsible for energy policy. I think Christopher learned about different types of policies through his Mandarinship. He was a great Mandarin too. And I think from that point of view, if you talk about an academic legacy, it actually means not just your primary and secondary school and the schooling during in the family context, but also being a Mandarin for a time, for a short while, really pushed him to talk things that were relevant and think things through. And then we go, and now I'm going to focus on the publications and the academic work, his initial research agenda, which then of course evolved, obviously, but there was a kind of current. I will use keywords to summarize, hopefully in a fair way, his complex thinking. And then, of course, a final focus on an agenda of concern, which he shared in his last publications. But in between, he had his parallel life as a responsible academic, as an administrator, an editor, a research manager, a research entrepreneur, a consultant. He even became a dean, and he did all things with a huge level of professionalism. So let's move to the content of Christopher's legacy. And the first keyword is managerialism. And what I'm going to do is each time give the key publications, and I've been unfair to his long publication list since I've been focusing on the books, only on the books, not on the articles. Exceptionally, I will refer and go beyond that. And so I will use that as the backbone to shape what I think is my vision of his legacy and the importance he had for our not just European but beyond academic community. I think the first really important book was in 1990, Managerialism and the Public Services, an Anglo-American experience, because after his PhD, he spent some time in the US, and that's also part of this comparative thinking he strongly emphasized. And that book was very successful and very important, and immediately got a second edition, 1993, Managerialism and the Public Services again, but Cuts or Cultural Change. And I think the jump to 2003, another, let's say, very clarifying book, The Essential Public Manager. These three books, if you look at the coherence of that, first of all, the focus on management. For most of us, this sounds almost like obvious. But in the 1980s, this was absolutely not obvious. There was a time the word management was not there in the public sector. There was a time we only spoke about administrators. And so we had to invent the word management within the public sector. And Christopher significantly contributed to that. I mean, there was Jim Perry, there was the Perry publication on what is public management, it's private management, and you bring it to the public sector. That was a very cheap American way of looking at management. But Christopher had a very complex, refined way. Having been a Mandarin, he understood that it didn't work like that. To bring in the word management, you should know that at the beginning of the 20th century, it was administrative sciences. IIS is the International Institute of Administrative Sciences. There's no distinction between public and private, the administrative sciences. And then after the Second World War, we had this shift where private and public became quite distinct. But it was still administration. And then we moved, let's say, at the end of the 70s, but beginning of the 80s, but the 90s certainly, to bring in the word management in the public sector, which did not exist. For most of us, and for young people, management was always there. No. And so to invent it and to coin it, because initially, if you look at the history of the conferences, the management key was not, there was no international public management network, there was nothing, there were no journals. It was within political sciences that things happened. It was within administrative sciences. And so the shift from administration and administrative sciences to management and management sciences, Christopher contributed significantly to that debate and actually helped push the field in this direction. And obviously, from management, we moved to new public management, which is like a kind of obsessive, extremist way. And I think those that are familiar with our shared publications know that NPM, the New Public Management Movement, which is very limited in time and space, and the New Zealand in the 1990s exactly, and based on economic new institutionalist theories, is a very narrow focused definition of management. Christopher expanded that concept also to the implications for managers. So not just have the management functions, but look what, having been a civil servant himself. And of course, the UK is a bit particular because they don't have citizens, they only have subjects, which is different. British subjects, not British citizens, even if they have a citizen's charter, but then they don't know what that really means. And so I think the fact that he could coin this from his British experience, but expand it in a European context and also refer to the American context, what is it? What does that mean for the people working within the public sector? What kind of animal is a public manager? How different is it from a public administrator? And so, and when he was in Leuven, he took this grand initiative to look at leadership, but not the general, leadership is a very complex word, and he didn't, actually we use the word elite in our public management reform book, elite, which is not a common word. Some people don't like the word elite. When I'm speaking in Scandinavia, I had once, it was not in Finland, but in Sweden, I once had to give a talk there, and they came to me during the break and said, well, we don't have elites, we are an egalitarian society. I said, oh really? And so Christopher supported that idea to say, actually, it's about elites. We have to talk about leadership, but elites are important too in the public sector. And so the study he made on how should we train leaders for the next generation, public sector leaders, understood here. It was something which occupied him and frustrated him in a sense that he saw that in all these national schools and to the courses in the existing universities were actually or absent or old-fashioned on leadership, public sector leadership. And so he made this very important study at the end of his career in Leuven, but his career in Leuven was always there. And so how to train public sector leaders is actually still an issue here. I move to a second key word, health. And again, it was connected to his private life. He was interested in health policy and the functioning of it because of his sister who was ill and suffered from her health conditions. And so he was very personally involved in this research topic. So it was a committed research type of person. Christopher was personally committed in what he was doing, personally implicated. It was not a distant relationship with the field. And again, I'm summarizing some of the books here with his close colleagues. Just Management, Power and Culture in the National Health Service, 1992. And then Controlling Health Professionals, 1994. And then you will apologize if I refer also to the things we wrote together. Continuity and Change in Public Policy and Management. We had two policy fields there, health and security. So we had police stations and hospitals. So we had actually a case study, Leuven and Brighton, police stations. So again, and just to tell the anecdote on that book, Christopher wanted it initially only on hospitals. And I could convince him. It's also a feature. It was able to convince him, even if he had very firm opinions on certain things. I said we should add police stations because it's a different type of professionals and different type, and so it will be scientifically actually more interesting to do that. And so we moved. But the hospitals were the crucial issue. The university hospitals in Leuven and the hospitals in Brighton. Now, if you look at these publications on health, first of all, he was able to synthesize. I think he considered himself as a quite good specialist in health management and health policy. Actually, the anecdote is when he suffered from his disease in the last years, he was actually more knowledgeable about the British hospitals than the doctors working there. And that created also two conversations which were unexpected for these doctors in a way. So again, it was a very professional way to look at it and distant, but very personal and committed. He made a comprehensive picture of the health policy, which is not common for many health specialists. He looked at structures, and his famous saying, because it was a reference to his humor, and if it would not be serious, it would be very funny in a way. He said the British health system is being structured, restructured, so it's structuring. He talked actually about organizing, reorganizing, reorganizing, disorganizing, redisorganizing. And so it was a continuation of all these redisorganizing of the British system, which he could describe and finally, in a fine way, actually show the deficit of the whole system of these organizations. The professionals, of course, there was already a reference to that, the position of professionals. He believed very strongly in professionals, a bit as a countervailing partner for managers, in a way. And the whole debate, if the professionals should become the managers, or if you could afford to have managers that are not professionals, in a sense, no medicals, and that debate, he tackled that too. Obviously, he looked at policies. Performance, the word performance, it will come back, also is a key issue, the performance of the health sector. And context, I will come back to the word context. Context was the seminal word and the choice of the word for his the seminar that we organized in Leuven when he became emeritus. And it was his choice to say, I want to do it on context, because so much nonsense is told about context. So let's try to make sense of context. And so but the context of the health system, of course, was something of his great concerns too. And so his whole approach of the health issue in a society was from a micro perspective, from a meso perspective, from a macro perspective. And I think that's very comprehensive and that's very courageous. But he had the intellectual capacity to do that. And also comparative, comparing national systems again and again. Compare not just for the fun of comparing, but for the duty of learning. What can we learn to improve systems? I think that was part of his explicit agenda to be relevant in a way. Performance, of course, when you move these days, Silva said it, the duty of academics is to be, to feel the pulse of the times, And performance is, of course, the pulse of the times in the reform agenda. 1995, it was an edited book, Christopher and I. It was actually our first book together in 1995. I will come back to that later on quality. He was at Brunel University. He was dean at Brunel University. And we had this shared project on quality. And again, I learned that from him. He said, in the audience, who is against quality? Who is against quality? Nobody is against quality. So it means we have different meanings. So we should unpack it. And so we unpacked the concept in a very inductive way, we had several interviews together. We did a lot of field research. So we went on the road together. And on that occasion, he also exposed me to the British wines. And that was very funny, that he wanted to convince me that the English wines, I should say, the English wines, actually not necessarily poison. They're actually quite drinkable. So the first drinking was blind. The bottle was covered, and I had to figure out what wine it was, and I failed immensely. But then I said, "Well, I think you are convincing me here." And so the other book, important book on performance in a broad meaning, was, and Hilka was one of the main contributors too, was on performance or compliance. It was on audit, the performance audit, and how public management was actually thinking in terms of performance through audit, and how audit functioned in a system, in a system way, and comparing 5 countries. That was a very important book. It is still a very influential book to see the categories of audit and the functions of audit offices which were mentioned there is still referred to as a framework, and it's still very, very relevant. And so, again, this was a thought-provoking and a frontline book, and it still is. Translated in Portuguese, I hope the Portuguese take benefit of it. So that was a bit of a joke. And so if you look at performance here, he took an institutional perspective. He was not so much interested in the mechanics of indicators, even if indicators, that was more my side. We were very complementary. I'm an have a bit of an engineering background, and he was history. I couldn't, engineers cannot beat historians, and perhaps vice versa. But we were very complementary in a way, and so I did the mechanics of performance and the measuring and so on. But he looked at the institutional perspective. Audit was one of them, a very crucial one. Comparative again, comparative. If research is not comparative, especially in our field, it's not so useful. Systems and roles, as I already mentioned. And then benchmarking, bench learning, and the common assessment framework. It's also something that has been very important in Christopher's thinking and in our collaboration too. We had the big European events where Katju Holkeri and several Finnish colleagues have contributed to the big events here linked to the presidencies of the European Union, where you had these initially 1,000 people, 1,000 civil servants coming from all levels of government and from different countries, applying the common assessment framework, again as a kind of device to improve systems with elements of award. So Christopher, Elke Loeffler, and myself were, for several of these big events, the scientific supporters, and we guided these conferences. But it was from a benchmarking, bench learning point of view, and I think it was a very important way also to shape our thinking, our debates. And Christopher was very, let's say, very explicit in his opinions on that, and I think that's something on how he coined and made an impact on performance. Time, place, and context. Again, as I said, from his youth, from his primary school, where history and geography were very important, when he came to Leuven to become research professor, his project, or one of his main projects, was on time and place, and then context followed. And I'm just listing some of the publications where time, place, and context became important. There is the context book, which is an edited book, and which is actually the papers of the seminar that was organized. I will come back to that too. New perspectives on public service, place, and technology. Again, also the book on continuity and change had significant elements. How do you compare in time? Some methodological issues, I come back to that too. And there was time, policy, management, governing with the past, which was also a crucial point. If you look at the fil rouge, the common denominators there, was to say, we have to look at long time series. That's a very important methodological statement, but it's an important element to take into account as a researcher. So Christopher was very convinced that too much research was myopic, was not taking enough distance and time series and long-term trends to look at that. Also to look at most different cases. He actually enjoyed most different than most similar cases. Because it was his conviction that from the most different cases, the learning impact was higher. And I think that's an important element here. Also, his ideas about connecting place and technology is fascinating in a way. To say, place stays important, but we can actually reduce the dysfunctionalities of place by importing technology. And then the historical contexts, of course. He was a big, let's say, generator of historical context to better understand what is going on. And as a condition, and that was also his criticism to a lot of case study descriptions or even quantitative research, that these historical contexts do matter and that we have to bring them on board. Reform, of course, reform. It's not improvement, it's reform. It's not change, it's reform. And there, it's a whole series, starting in 1998, decentralizing, unbundled agencies, and adaptations and alternatives. This is all about reform. Describing reform. How do you describe reform? That's not just a theoretical question, it's a very practical question. Especially since there was an awareness with Christopher that organizations forget, societies forget, systems forget. And so the word Alzheimer emerges too. And it's indeed, when we were working together, sometimes you say, people have forgotten their own past. in a way. And of course, a key book, which I'm very happy I've written with many people, but Christopher is my favorite co-author. I can't say this in other audiences, but here I can certainly say it because it's true. He's my favorite co-author, and I've written with many people. But the Public Management Reform book, again, it's on reform, and it's the history of writing this book is also, let's say, a fascinating story of how we discussed how to map reform and how to conclude on reforms. But if we look at the common denominators of the whole thinking on reform by Christopher, I think it's the word trajectory emerges. So it's not one problem, one solution with a one-to-one relationship, and then we go to the party. Reforms are sequences with very complex trajectories, which we need to map. And it's long-term scales again. And so from that point of view, I think that's why we could work very well together. We shared these views. And so the discussion, what is the start and the end of the reform? Is there an end of a reform? Of course not. I'm sorry to tell you, there is no end at the reforms. So also the concept of success and failure, and how do we define a successful reform? How do we define a failure? Is a failure really a failure if you learn from it? And so the concept of residue emerged, a kind of archaeological way of thinking in terms of reform. Each reform, even if it fails, even if the ruins are there, the ruins of reform are the foundations for a next cycle. And to map the ruins of reform, it's a painful exercise, but we need to do it, and we cannot ignore it, really. And so failure suddenly becomes part of the picture, and to map it. And so suddenly failure is not really failure, and success should be, let's say, qualified, because sometimes it's based on a failure. And so this idea of residue, like sediment, the sediments of reform, and the layers, and then you cut it through like an archaeologist, and you study all the layers of the reform. You know, this was like, and that, of course, that fitted with his historical idea and time too. And so that was, in the last edition of the Public Management Reform book, one of the suggested topics and visualizations in our schemes there. The focus point in the Public Management Reform book is elites. I already mentioned that. Elites. Not leadership. Not managers. Elites. And of course, democratic elites. You have to have circulations of that. And the two key words here are feasibility and desirability of reforms. It's only when elites say that reforms are feasible and desirable that something will happen. If elites say it's feasible but not desirable, or it's desirable but not feasible, or the worst thing, it's not feasible and not desirable, nothing will happen. And so we have to focus also on that. If we want to organize reform, we have to tackle feasibility and desirability. That's why he then connected it to leadership within the organizations. How do you train people, and how do you actually affect feasibility and desirability? Also the concept of uncertainty. Not again, but ambiguity and uncertainty. Paradoxes, dilemmas, trade-offs. He didn't promise a rose garden. Reforms are no walk in the park. And reforms are political also. For a long time, the managerial literature said reforms are purely technical. but reforms are, in the first place, political. And to put that very explicit was actually a novelty too, to say, because the managerial agenda was captured by some managerial, let's say, managerial, how should I phrase that properly, technicians. And of course it was political. If you looked at New Zealand, you could almost ask, where are the politicians? And so to bring back the politics is important there. Context again. Theories of change. We developed best boomerang, earthquake, stalactite, tortoise. If you are intrigued, read the book. Methods. Also, it's something on methods. Christopher had very firm opinions on methods. How to organize his research activities, and certainly also how not to organize his research activities. That's very important too. And so there are, and his last, I'm making publicity now, read this. This is a must read, his last book. I repeat, this is a must read. It's the advanced introduction. The title is a bit misleading. It's actually, it's more than an introduction. It's advanced, comprehensive vision on public management and public administration, really. And those that are not familiar with it, run to the bookshop and get it. And it's about how to compare. What are facts? It's not a philosophical book. It has some very concrete issues too. What are facts? Is it the announcement? Is it the written legislative reality? Is it the implementation? Is it the effect of the decisions? What are facts? Because you have facts in reality. We construct facts, of course. It's a social construct in a way. But the question is, how do you recycle these constructed facts in a scientific way? How do you use it in a scientific way? So that was a major concern for him. He also preferred what he called thick descriptions. It's the substantial case studies, embedded thick descriptions. And then, of course, the balance between purity of the research and the relevance of that research. On relevance, I want to refer to one, I referred only to books, but I want to refer to one lecture he gave. It's the Brabant lecture at one of the IIS conferences in Ifrane in Morocco in 2014. Towards a New World, some inconvenient truths on Anglosphere public administration. It was actually a criticism on the domination and why the Anglosphere, he called it the Anglosphere, of public administration, how this is being rebalanced. And of course, this was to say that other parts outside the Anglo-Saxon world become so important that we cannot neglect it. Relevance, it's about relevance versus being rigorous. It's about the megatrends. Megatrends in the policy field, demography, environment, economy, aging, digital, of course, all the megatrends and how that impacts. He was really very absorbed by this and worried that the whole administrative science thinking was getting disconnected from these megatrends, while they should be flooded by them. And so the Anglosphere, that is a quote from that speech, the Anglosphere public management thinking may be losing its dominant position. And he gives some arguments for that, which I will not repeat here. An interesting element also, and a conviction of him, to teach theory and methods together. Now it's separated. We have to teach it together to make sure that the theory can be tested and the methods are useful. Otherwise you get emptiness. And of course, and we share that conviction, critical realism and the epistemological positions rather than scientific orthodoxy or radical constructivism. He was really absolutely convinced of critical realism. Whether he read novels or produced science, it was critical realism in a way. This may be a bit of a surprise, but this is, I'm almost at the end of my description and testimony in a way of Christopher's legacy. When we were working together on the quality project and produced the book in 1995, published by Sage, we had a trip to one of the manors, Christopher and I, Clifton Manor. It was in 1993. It was a summer, and I suffered heavily from hay fever. And there we actually coined a collaboration, an intellectual collaboration for the future of how to work together and push administrative sciences, be it management or policy. So Clifton Manor was a crucial stage, also for Christopher. I think he was at Brunel, but he was, he wanted to get out of Brunel in a way to come to the continent for personal and professional reasons. And I showed him one picture during our walk in the park here. I will share that picture with you. It's a picture, it's a photo from, I don't know if you know the Solvay company, the chemistry Solvay company. Well, Mr. Solvay, after he ruined 5 times his family, he found a magic formula and became then very wealthy. So Mr. Solvay is on the picture, but if you look carefully, it's a seminar from 1911 in Brussels, organized by Mr. Solvay. You will see Madame Curie, you see Mr. Einstein, you see De Broglie, you see all the key physicists and chemists of the world at that time. Most of them got Nobel Prizes. Mr. Solvay invited all of them in his manor in Brussels to discuss the future of chemistry, physics, and all of that. I showed this picture to Christopher at Clifton Manor in 1993. And I said to Christopher, why don't we organize something like that for public administration? Let's do that. To push our thinking, to push our ideas. Who do you think should be there? So that was, let's say, for a long time I had this picture in my office, so he looked at it all the time to say, who was that again? And so what we did was put this seminar together, much later, in 2012, when we organized his emeritus seminar. I said to him, now we will do what Solvay did. Invite all the key people whom we know and whom we want to be there to advance part of our knowledge in a particular field. And he said it would be the topic of context, and it would be the key people. He said, they should be around the table, just like Solvay did at the time. And I will now, this is 2 more slides, with 2 quotes from Christopher during the dinner speech. He had a dinner speech for that event, and I would like to quote it because it is fair to hear, if not his voice, his ideas of what he spoke in March 29th, 2012. And I will read it. Moving on to the particulars, as most of you know, I started working live as a civil servant, not an academic. And I have continued to do advice and consultancy work for the world of practice throughout my career. That is hardly unusual in our field, but it does provoke some boundary-spanning thoughts. One is simply that our field of study however low and dusty a position it may sometimes occupy in the academic pecking order, is one of huge and enduring importance to the very foundations of civilized society. I kind of believed this already when I entered academic life, but now, all these years later, I am absolutely convinced of it. And I would like to continue from that same speech. It's actually the last paragraph of the speech. The conclusion I draw from this is that we should exert our best energies to preserve our time for thinking and to safeguard our academic independence. These are not God-given privileges which will always be there as a matter of course. On the contrary, there are significant currents in contemporary university life which have been putting both of them under pressure for some time, both for the health of our internal academic community and for the value of our multifarious external relations with the world of practice. We should hold tightly onto these things. That is what I have tried to do, and that is what I want to pass on to those who are following our lucky generation. Thank you very much.